So today, guys, we're going to be looking at the Necromancer Tank with a bit of detail. We're going to look at, like, the positives, the negatives. We're going to look at the kind of group buffs that they offer, and then go over all the useful skills and passives and how those kind of function and when you should use them and why you should use them. So all the information that you kind of need to know about the Necro Tank. We've also got a little build that I've got on this particular character. Obviously, there's lots of different builds that all function in a similar way, so that's going to vary from player to player, but I'll just give you a little look at what I'm using myself. So we'll start off with the skills and passives, and obviously you got the Gravelord section of this build, of this character, and one of the main things that makes Necromancers really, really useful still now, so it's really one of the only things, it's the combination of the Colossus ultimate combined with their fast ulti-gen. So one of the things that's really good about the Necromancer is they offer the Colossus, which inflicts major vulnerability. Now, the reason why this is so strong is it opens up the opportunity to use different tank gear. So some tanks will use things like Turning Tide and maybe Archdruid, but you could also just use a Colossus to replace that and then use alternative gear instead. So it's a really strong ultimate still, and it's one of the main reasons to use a Necro. So you would use that, you apply the major vulnerability debuff for 12 seconds and it increases the damage that the enemy takes by 10%. And yeah, it's just a really, really strong ultimate that you want to be using. And when it comes to the morph of which one you do use, some people like to use this particular morph, which will apply some disease damage. Other people like to use the other morph, which is like a frost morph, but it stuns enemies. So there's kind of two ways you can look at it. The stun can be useful, but if you want to chain enemies in and pull enemies in, and then you don't want them to be stunned, then obviously you wouldn't use the other morph. So it doesn't really matter from a tank perspective which morph you actually use, but that is a potential option for your ultimate. Now, you wouldn't always need to use a Colossus for a Necro Tank, because you can kind of use a Horn, and then, as I said before, you might be using a gear set that provides the same thing. But then on the same side, you could also get the benefit of the Horn with the Colossus by using something like Sax Champion. So there's many different ways to set up a Necro to benefit from having this major vulnerability and offering different things. With Flame Skull, it's not a skill that's really needed. It doesn't really do a lot. Blast Bones. This is actually a useful tank skill. And it might seem strange because it is a damage skill, but you've got a Stamina Morph and you've got a Magicka Morph. Now, the Magicka Morph is the one I would personally use. The reason for using Blast Bones is purely down to the corpse creation. So one of the things that's really good about a Necromancer is creating corpses to gain ultimate back. And it's just a really fun method of play by spamming corpse creation and using that to use your ultimate more often and keep a higher uptime of your ultimate, and also that will work well depending on different gear sets that you're using as well. So if you're using Nazare, if you're using Sax Champion, you want to be using ultimates and you want to be using as much ultimate as possible to get as much benefit from using that ultimate. So the Necromancer being a fast ulti-gen kind of class works really well. If you use Blast Bones, it will create a corpse on a very regular basis, because as you can see there, you summon a skeleton from the ground. After 2.5 seconds, the skeleton runs at the target and explodes. When it explodes, it creates a corpse. So that means that sort of every couple of seconds, whenever you've got spare Magicka, you could be casting Blast Bones to create an additional corpse to consume, to gain some ultimate. The next skill we've got is Unnerving Boneyard. So this is kind of, in a way, a replacement for where other classes might use caltrops in ad pulls, in trials, in dungeons for that AoE major breach. The Necro's actually got this built into their actual class. So you've got the major breach there that is going to apply reduced spell and physical resistance to enemies, meaning they're going to die faster because the group's got more pen. The fact that it consumes a corpse, like, that's not really something that you want in a way. You don't want corpses to be consumed to increase the damage, because you want to be using those corpses for gaining ultimate. Standing in the graveyard can activate the Grave Robber Synergy, so it provides a group synergy. So this is useful for trial content as well, where you need to offer a synergy to an Alkosh user. It's also useful to provide this as an off-tank to the main tank, who might be using Harmony Jewelry. So there's like a lot of additional functions by having this available, but the main reason is to provide that AoE major breach. The Skeletal Mage And again, another skill that's, it's not essential, but it's a corpse creation skill. So once again, just like Blast Bones, you can use this as a way to use up some resources to create more corpses. So it's not like essentially a really, really useful tank skill, but in terms of having it available for corpse creation is good. So you can use this, and it lasts for 20 seconds. If you recast this after 10 seconds, it will create a corpse. If you recast it sooner than that, though, it won't create the corpse, it'll just refresh the skill. But if you wanted to create that corpse, you just need to refresh it halfway through the duration of the ability. So every 10 seconds, basically, to get yourself another corpse. And like I say, this is a really good way to build up your ulti regen to be one of the craziest, fastest ulti gens in the game. Next, you got Shocking Siphon. So, violently drain the last spark of life from a corpse, dealing shock damage over 20 seconds to all enemies around the corpse and between you and the corpse. In some very rare situations as a tank, you might need this for being able to activate Elemental Catalyst. There's not many classes that can actually get 100% value from using Elemental Catalyst as a tank, so the DK doesn't have access to lightning in a very easy way. They have to spam skills every 3 seconds. By using this, you've got a long duration dot that will tick and keep ticking lightning damage, and so this is really useful if you needed to maintain, because then you can obviously use a fire skill, and you can use your frost blockade, and you're able to access all 3 things. So it's really good if you need to do that. So Asylum Sanctorium main tank. If you maybe the off tank in Cloud Rest, you might be put on EC duty, but that's like pretty much it in terms of the EC usage on a tank. But that'd be a good skill if you were on that. Reusable parts. When your Blast Bone, Skeletal Mage, or Spirit Mender dies, the cost of your next Blast Bone, Skeletal Mage, or Spirit Mender is reduced by 50%. So this really works well in terms of, as we said before, the corpse creation. If you're spamming corpse creation with Blast Bones and Mage, you're then going to get a reduced cost of recasting them. So this is really good in terms of doing that same like method of play style with the Necro, where you're able to keep creating corpses and they're going to be cheaper, and you can just keep creating more and more and more and making use of your Magicka if you don't need it for other things. The other passives for a Necro aren't super useful. They're damage orientated, which can be taken if you've got the spare skill points, but they're not the primary ones that you must take, because increase your dot damage, increase your spell and physical pen. Obviously, those are good things to have in the long term if you've got enough skill points once you've got all your tank skills and passives unlocked, but they're not essential from the get-go. On the Bone Tyrant section, we've got the Bone Goliath transformation. And it kind of does seem good in terms of what it offers, but it's just not as good as the Colossus group buff, and then it's not as good as the Reanimate ultimate, which is a recovery ultimate as well. So you've got 2 good ultimates, and this is like the worst one of the 3 in a way. I've seen a lot of people obviously use it for PvP. I see some beginner tanks use this as like a survival tool. I don't think it's like an essential thing. It's not quite as good as things like Magma Shell from my personal usage of it. But yeah, it increases your max health by 30k. So if you're on like 40k max health already, obviously you go to a huge max health and it immediately restores 30k health as well. But yeah, it's not something that I think you should slot, because there's lots of other ultimates you could use that are more beneficial to both yourself and a group, rather than this, which is completely just a self-usage thing. Hungry Scythe is the next skill, and both morphs here have some kind of use. So Hungry Scythe is your tank heal skill. It will do magic damage, and it's AoE magic damage, so that's decent. It heals you for 5,290 health for the first hit, and then additional for each enemy hit. So the more enemies that you hit with this, the more it's going to heal you for, and then it heals you over time as well for 10 seconds. It all scales off max health. It's not as good as other heals in the game. Like, as you can see there, you heal for 5,290. When you compare that to like the Dragon Knight, the Dragon Knight's base heal, so Coagulating Blood, will hit for like 7 or 8k health, and 50% additional on top of that based on missing health. So it's a big impact heal. The Sorcerer Tank has a huge heal. It heals for like 15k with the pets. This is 5k, so it's quite low. But then it's like it's because it's more aimed at being an AoE heal and then a heal over time. It's got multi layers to it, so it is a strong heal. But if you're just going up against one enemy, obviously it's not going to be as impactful. You might have to cast it a couple of times to get the full benefit. The reason you go with Hungry Scythe is because it's Magicka costing, Obviously, that's more beneficial for every tank is going with the magic version of every skill if you can. You can, however, use the other morph, Ruinous Scythe. Now, the reason you might use Ruinous Scythe is it causes off balance. Now, the reason we don't really use it at the moment is because people aren't using the Exploiter champion point passive to benefit from off balance damage. But if they were, and if you wanted to have some better sustain potentially, because when you heavy attack an enemy that is off balance, you restore a lot more resources. So it's something that isn't totally terrible, because obviously it causes a group benefit. Off balance is a group benefit, but it's just not good enough at the moment to consider using that instead of Hungry Scythe. Beckoning Armor. So again, both morphs of this skill are actually quite useful. Beckoning Armor is the general best option. So you wrap yourself in Hardened Bones, you get yourself Major Resolve, which is going to boost up your resistances. While active, enemies that strike you with a ranged attack will be pulled towards you once every 2 seconds, and they are taunted. So that's kind of new with the Scribes of Fate now, where you pull in an enemy, but then it also taunts them as well. So they stay aggroed on you. It's really, really strong because it's able to do that taunt as well now. One of the things that some people don't realise with this skill is if you cast it, straight away, as soon as you get hit by a ranged enemy, it will reset that 2-second timer. So you don't have to actually wait 2 seconds. You only have to wait 2 seconds if you activate the skill and then leave it. If you wanted to pull enemies faster, you activate it. When an enemy hits you, they get pulled in. You then press the button again to reset your Beckoning Armor timer, and then you can instantly pull someone in again. So that isn't mentioned there, because obviously you're having to spend 2,381 Magicka. But when you actually compare, spending 2,381 Magicka to refresh that timer is cheaper than a Dragon Knight using Unrelenting Grip. Unrelenting Grip has a much higher cost than this does to recast it. So it is an option to use this as a chain skill. It is a bit slower though. It's not as fast as Silverleash. It's not as fast as Unrelenting Grip. But it is fast enough to rely just on using this, maybe combined with your Vatashran one-handed shield. Like if you went into an ad pull, you hit your Void Bash, and then any enemies that didn't get pulled in, you could just taunt them. And then you just recast this to activate that pull, basically. Another thing with this is it creates a corpse when it expires. So once again, if you recast this after 10 seconds, it will create a corpse, which you can then use to get ultimate back. So it's a really, really strong skill. In situations where you don't actually need the pull and the taunt, you could go with Summoner's Armor, which is the other morph. Now this is really useful when you're trying to gain ultimate back faster by summoning and absorbing corpses. So as we mentioned, the corpse creation, it's really good for that. It will reduce the cost of your summoning skills, plus create a corpse when it ends. So by using the Summoner's morph, it reduces the cost of all your other summoning skills. So it's not something you'd use all the time, but for trial content, where you don't have enemies that need to be pulled in, or maybe you're using Silverleash to get that quicker pull, then you could potentially use the other morph of this, Summoner's Armor, to create corpses more cost effectively, to get your ultimate back faster, to then dish out more ultimates, whether it's a Horn, whether it's a Colossus, or whatever ultimate it is you're using. So both morphs have their uses, because not everywhere is going to be good where you need a chain and a taunt. The next skill for me, one of the most essential skills for the Necro. This is what makes Necro tanks absolutely fantastic. So Necrotic Potency is one of my most favourite skills in the whole game. And it's free, is the number one thing. It doesn't cost any resources to cast it, which is absolutely great. You sap the lingering life from fresh corpses, granting you 6 ultimate and a healing 1505 health every 1 second for 2 seconds per additional corpse. This ability scales off your max health. So the fact that Hungry Scythe isn't a huge heal can be combated in a way that if you've got enough corpses on the ground, you've got a heal with Necrotic Potency that's free on top of that. The fact that you also gain 6 ultimate per corpse is huge. So just by yourself, you've got Beckoning Armor, you've got the skills we looked at before, so Blast Bones, Skeletal Mage, and then we've also got obviously Spirit Guardian from Living Death. So you've got 4 corpse abilities. That's a lot of ultimate that you can potentially gain sort of every 10 seconds or sooner. So Blast Bones is going to come back sooner. You've got the other 3 corpses that you can get every 10 seconds. And then you've got all the enemy corpses as well. So the ultimate potential that you can build through this skill is unbelievable. Now the other morph's called Deadened Pain, and it gives you major protection, which isn't worth doing because you have to absorb corpses to get major protection. But you can get major protection just by slotting Revealing Flare and having to do nothing. So there's no point in putting a skill where you have to absorb corpses to get major protection when you can just slot a skill to get it 100% of the time with no effort. With Necrotic Potency, you get more ultimate than you do with the other morph, which is obviously vastly superior. And I really think this is one of the most essential skills in the game. And this is what, like I say, this is what makes the Necro Tank still viable now. So there's not really, when you actually look at why the Necro Tanks get used, the only reason really to use them is for their ulti-gen and to perform that Colossus more often. Obviously combining that with their potential to use things like EC, their potential to do more ice damage and keep up brittle and the double frost staff kind of builds. But really, there's not like a lot of buffs and benefits that are offered by the Necro. But because of Necrotic Potency and that ulti-gen, it's one of the major reasons why they're so good, because they can build ultimate faster than anyone else. I think with the right setup, we're able to regenerate our Colossus back in sort of 8 to 10 seconds if we were using ulti benefit and gear as well, which is just unbelievable. Being able to pull back that sort of ultimate in that short space of time is really good. One of the additional benefits on top of that is while slotted, your damage taken is reduced by 3%. So it's got like a lot of layers to it. It's a lot of benefits to using a skill. You've got to have it on your front bar. You want to have it slotted. You want to be casting it as often as you can because it's free. And you want to be zapping the life out of every corpse possible. Next we've got Agony Totem. Now this isn't a great skill in terms of crowd control. So as we've mentioned many times over the years, when you do crowd control, you want to have a skill that provides a immobilization. So you pull in the enemies and you immobilize them, and you can also snare them if you want, and then you apply your debuffs to the enemies. When you use Agony Totem is a fear. So if you're using something to pull enemies in, so like for dungeons and whatnot, you pull enemies in and then nothing happens. It doesn't do anything because they're on the same cooldown for crowd control, so it's not really super effective in a sense of casting this for ad pulls. It is useful in terms of the things that it does provide though. So you've got minor protection to you and allies. So it's a group buff. It's going to give you and allies minor protection, which is nice. Another thing that it does is, so it does fear enemies. So if you went into an ad pull, you put it down, it would fear the nearby enemies. Then you could chain in the further back enemies. So it does have some potential of use in certain content. But one of the other big things here is allies can activate the Pure Agony synergy, causing enemies to take magic damage over 5 seconds and applying minor vulnerability. So the Necro, this is another skill that's worth using because applying minor vulnerability is really useful, increasing enemies damage by 5%. You've already given major vulnerability with your Colossus, and then you're giving your group a buff as well with minor protection. So it's worth having this being used to provide some additional group benefit, both defensive and offensive. Next, you've got Empowering Grasp. Now, this obviously isn't as good as it used to be, but it does have kind of some benefit. Works in a similar way to the Sorcerer's Crowd Control skill, where it only works straight in front of you. It's not very easy to use. It's got an 18 by 5 meter radius, so it's basically just slightly wider than the width of your character, and then straight ahead 18 meters. So this is why I say that they're not really very good for crowd control, because they don't have a good immobilize skill that works in that 360-degree radius like the DK, like the Warden do, and that makes it a little bit more tricky to be effective for ad pulls compared to those other classes. But it does have some use. If you wanted to use an immobilize, this is really your only option. It will hit things in front of you. It does apply multiple different things, so it will apply minor maim. It will give a stun to certain enemies. Like, it creates these 3 patches. It does buff your group in a certain way, so it gives Empower to your allies and enchants the damage and healing of your summons by 1,000. Empower isn't as good of a buff as it used to be, so it's something you can provide, but it's not something that is as useful as it used to be. So do consider that. You have to look at what type of builds people are playing to see if Empower is even worth bothering with, because this is on a short cooldown as well. In terms of the passives, you've got Death Gleaning. This got a nice buff recently where now whenever an enemy you are in combat with dies within 28 meters of you, you restore 666 Magicka and Stamina. So a big upgrade on this. It used to be like a lot lower. So you are going to get a lot more resources back, and you don't even have to really be doing anything. You don't have to get the last hit or the last kill. It will just apply to enemies that you're in combat with in a 28 meter radius, which is huge. So you've got a lot of potential of incoming resources there, especially through ad pulls or bosses that have got ad phases or things going around. You've got potential to be restoring some resources. Disdain Harm, reduce the damage you take from damage over time abilities by 15%. This is one of the things that actually makes the Necro Tank one of the stronger tanks to use for harder content. So when you go into the newer trials and the newer dungeons, they have a lot of damage over time abilities now that cause a lot of damage to the tank. Let's think something like Barsai Hard Mode in Rockgrove. The Necro Tank, there was a lot of people that switched over to Necro Tank, especially after the nerf to Mist Form. People switched to the Necro Tank because of this passive, pretty much. Because there's very few ways to actually reduce damage over time. There's loads of ways to reduce your damage. Like, single target damage can be reduced with resistances, buffs, debuffs to the enemy, and blocking. You can block and instantly reduce that incoming damage by 80%, 90%. You can then apply other things on top of that, which makes the damage basically... an enemy's base damage from 100% could go down to 5% or 3% damage being done to you because of the things that you can do to it. When it comes to damage over time effects, you don't have that same luxury, because the only things that can actually reduce damage over time is your 1 CP tree and your resistances and this passive. So reducing damage over time is so much easier on a Necro thanks to this passive, because there are very few ways to actually reduce dots down to be manageable. But this is one of the things that you can do. So this makes them a very, very strong for endgame content, for tanking, because you can deal with dots, which is a very frequent thing now, much, much easier than pretty much every other class. Okay, the next passive, increase your healing received. This is fine. Like, you will generally have a few different abilities. So as you can see here, you are going to have Hungry Scythe on your front bar, most likely. You are going to have Necrotic Potency on your front bar. You might have Agony Totem on your front bar, depending on what's running on your back bar. So you are going to get a decent amount of healing received bonus there. 6%. It's not quite as good as what the Dragon Knight can obtain, but healing received is useful for some places where you get, like, obviously those big dot damage, where you're taking those big dots. Anywhere where you get debuff to your healing, your self-healing, obviously it's really good to have healing received benefits on there. And then finally, Last Grasp, increase your max health. So you get a nice little bit of extra max health, which is always good for a tank. Okay, Living Death. We've got the Reanimate Ultimate. Renewing Animation is the morph that I like. It costs a lot. Now, one of the things I will say is, one of the great things about a Necromancer is they can use Sax Champion with a Colossus to give the damage benefits of the Colossus with the Major Force. They also have the benefit of the survival in new groups. If you're on a Necro Tank in a beginner group, a progression group, you could slot Renewing Animation, because that means then you can recover fights all by yourself, pretty much, by resurrecting people without having to do anything, and still provide the Major Force if you're wearing Sax. This is such a good ultimate. I've seen it used in a lot of places. Like, I've seen people use it in dungeon groups where you've got new players in a dungeon and they're all dead. You're the only one still alive. It doesn't matter, because you've got Renewing Animation. You cast it. It's quite a big AoE hit that it does. It's got a big range on it. 28 meter range. 12 meter radius. So it hits a 12 meter radius, but you can throw it at a distance. You don't have to walk over and stand on top of people. But you can resurrect up to 3 allies. And because it's instant, it means you're able to recover fights even if everyone else is dead. If you think about this, if you had like Renewing Animation, you were using Sax Champion, maybe you had Pearlescent Ward as well, you'd have huge damage reduction by wearing Pearl. You'd be able to res people with Sax and still provide the damage benefits of both Pearl and all your other things, and your Major Force. So there's like a lot of good things you can do with a Necro to make them useful, even in situations where bad things will happen to your group. where people have died, where things aren't going so well, where you're in those progression runs, where you're in those beginner runs, where you're with people who don't know what they're doing, you can single-handedly recover fights, even as a tank. So this is a really good ultimate to use. Obviously, for more experienced players, they're not going to use this generally, but it's such a good thing to keep your eye on and use if you need it. Render Flesh. Sacrifice your own power to repair damaged flesh, healing you or an ally in front of you for 7, 7, 9, 8 health, but applying minor defile. Like, I don't think it's quite an expensive skill. It's going to cost you magicka, and it's then going to cost you the fact that you're going to have that minor defile applied to you, reducing your health recovery and healing received by 8%. Like 7k heal is bigger than your actual main heal. So, I mean, it's not something I ever use, and I can't see a great reason to use it. But, I mean, I guess if you really wanted to sacrifice yourself, you could. Expunge. I don't really use this, but I think that it has some kind of use. So, it's basically a purge. So, embrace the power of death, removing 2 negative effects from yourself. It's a purge that costs health. So it's kind of risky. But the thing is, with like efficient purge, for example, is a group-based purge, and it's very, very magicka expensive. This is quite low in cost. So I can see the use for this. Like when you're doing solo situations. I mean, in VHOF, when you're the off tank, you're standing in the middle of the room. Obviously, you could use this if you're going to stay there the entire fight. If you do go into group, you would need to have efficient purge. But I can see places where you do have to kind of run off and be by yourself. Using a little bit of health might help you to not burn out on your magicka. And then the fact is, while slotted, the cost of all your abilities are reduced by 3%. So it's got like a bit of a passive benefit as well of cost reduction. Now, you do have a couple of different morphs with this skill as well. So you've got Expunge and Modify. You restore magicka and stamina for each negative effect removed. So not only could you use health to remove the negative effects, you could then give yourself some resources back. So I can see the use for that. And then Hexproof reduces the cost as the ability ranks up and increases the amount of negative effects removed. So you could remove up to 4 negative effects, and it's going to reduce the health cost to do so. So I don't think it's like a super useful skill to use, but I could see there might be like specific places where maybe you're the only person who has some kind of negative effect applied to you, or some kind of thing that you've got to deal with, at which point you might want to use it. And then the fact that like you get some potential sustain benefits, or you can remove more negative effects, I can see why that might get used. Life amid death. Release residual fragments of fallen souls at the target location, healing you and allies. It's not something you're going to use for a tank, I wouldn't say, but like if you were going to proc like a set, I don't know, if you needed to proc Symphony of Blades, then obviously you would use something like that, because it will be an AoE heal. Next we've got Spirit Guardian. I prefer the Spirit Guardian morph. This is another skill that creates a corpse, so it's going to be really valuable to go alongside your necrotic potency to get you ultimate back. The main reason for using this is while active, 10% of the damage you take is transferred to the spirit. So it's like damage mitigation. It's going to transfer some damage over to this, so you can receive more damage and pass it on. So this is another reason which makes like the Necro Tank really good at dealing with dots and various damage, because you've got the reduced dot damage, but then you've also got the ability to transfer some of that damage over to the Spirit Guardian. So it's really, really useful. And yeah, it's also going to heal you. The problem is the heal is not super reliable. So the Spirit heals you or the lowest health ally around you. Now I can see again why there's some benefit to that. Because like let's say you go into the Cloud Rest portal, you're on full health, but one of your teammates has lost a lot of health. That could run off and then go and heal them and keep them alive so you don't wipe the portal. Do you know what I mean? So there is like different effects there that it would be useful. The main thing being that you can transfer that damage over. You can get a corpse as well. It's a very, very important skill for a lot of tank situations. The last main skill, we've got Mortal Coil. Again, this is something that got updated fairly recently. So you siphon the life from a corpse. So you do lose a corpse here. So you would lose the ultimate that you would have gained from necrotic potency, but instead you get a heal. And it's a heal over time. It's a very small heal over time. 10,890 health over 12 seconds is very, very small. But it's not just for you, it's you and allies between you and the corpse. The main reason why you might use this is you also restore 170 magicka and stamina every 2 seconds while siphoning the corpse. So you'll get 6 ticks of 170 magicka and stamina over the duration. While slotted, your healing done is increased as well. So you would get the healing boost of having this slotted. I don't think it's something you're going to want to use all the time, but there are some situations where you've got intense, like, resource management issues. I don't think it's going to be as, like, visual now with Harmony Jewelry. If you're in a trial situation, there's a lot of places where Harmony is going to be enough to be using synergies to survive and get through things without having the sustain issues that you used to have. So the Necro has always been one of the more difficult to sustain. But if you are in a place where you are having problems, then using Mortal Coil would be a good option to have slotted, just so you can have that benefit. And the heal over time is a nice perk as well. Okay, while you have negative effects on you, your healing done is increased. So a good passive. So when you've got negative effects on, healing is going to be increased. So this you don't have to have one of these skills slotted either. So you are going to be able to be sat on your front bar. You're going to be able to be hitting your 2 healing skills with Necrotic Potency and Hungry Scythe, and benefiting from this passive if you've got negative effects. Near-death experience. While you have a living death ability slotted, your critical strike chance with all healing abilities increased by up to 20%. So it can be useful to have a living death skill slotted on your front bar for high damage situations. Because if you was, like, for example, to be using renewing animation in your ulti slot but not using it, you've just got it on your front bar so you can have the benefit of that passive. And then you've got like a healing debuff, such as the Cloud Rest healing debuff, where you get the Baneful Mark, and you've got to heal yourself, as well as having the healer heal you out of that Baneful Mark. And this would really help your own self-healing part, and the bit you've got to do for yourself to get out of that, by having that passive available on your main bar while you're spamming your healing skills. That would really, really help, because obviously it increases usefulness based on severity. Corpse consumption. So we're already doing a lot of corpse consumption. And you're going to get the additional benefit of when you use an ability on a corpse, you generate 10 ultimate. And at every 16 seconds. So you've not just got the benefit of Necrotic Potency giving you that corpse and ultimate back. You've also got the benefit of the fact that you're going to proc this passive with it as well once every 16 seconds. You should be virtually casting this on cooldown, because you're going to be pretty much using Necrotic Potency on every time this corpse is available. This is going to proc as well to give you that extra 10 ultimate. So the ultimate capabilities, the ultimate generation capabilities of a Necro is just absolutely huge. And then finally, while you have Blast Bones, Skeletal Mage, Spirit Mender active, your health, magic, and stamina recovery is increased by 200. So a nice boost to your recoveries, which should be very active a lot of the time, because it's good to have Spirit Mender active most of the time, spamming Blast Bones for corpses. You're likely going to be benefiting from this extra recovery a lot of the time. In terms of my gear, obviously Vatashran One Hand and Shield. The Necro is the same as pretty much everything other than the Dragon Knight, where you can't really afford for dungeon content to not use this, because if you go into a dungeon, using Beckoning Armor takes too long to pull everything in. If you use Silver Leash, you're not going to be able to sustain it. So you have to use Vatashran One Hand and Shield. Obviously, for bosses, you could switch it off for the Master Sword and Board instead. And yeah, this is just going to pull everything in with one button and debuff it as well. So really, really strong. I'm using Sax Champion on my Necro just because it seems so well suited for the Necro. When you look at the set, Max Magicka, Minor Aegis, Max Stamina, more Max Stamina, and then when you're in combat, unit to 11 group members within 28 meters gain Major Force for 1 second per 15 ultimate spend. So you can generate so much ultimate so quickly with the Necro. You could then use your Colossus almost on cooldown in some cases, depending on how many corpses you've got. And then you're also able to provide that double benefit with Major Force and with the Colossus. With my weapons, for add pulls, I always like to go defending and then any enchant. With the shield, you can use whatever you want. I've got Sturdy here. I think that's the one I had. But using Divines, using Reinforced is also fine. On the Ice Staff, Infused Crush is good. You could switch it to Charged for add pulls. Alright, the other gear set I'm using is Pearlescent Ward. a great gear set. I absolutely love this gear set since it came into the game. It just gives you that option of increasing your group's damage and that survivability. So as I mentioned before, if my group was to all be dead and I'm wearing Sax Champion, I'm wearing Pearlescent Ward, I've got the Reanimate Ultimate, you've got many things that can help you recover fights. We've got max health, more minor Aegis. That's the only downside to using double trial gear, is you do get an overlap on minor Aegis. Healing taken, increased max health, and then, yeah, the Pearlescent Ward buff. 180 spell and weapon damage to people when they're alive. And then, based on how many people are dead, up to 66% damage reduction. All of my gear is in Divines. And on my helmet, I use Magma Incarnate with Magicka Recovery and Stamina Recovery. Just the one piece because I like to use Spalder of Ruin. Because I'm not using any other gear that benefits my group in terms of weapon and spell damage increases, I like to use this with that. And because I don't have to do anything to activate that, I just kind of stand there. One of the things that I've always found to be a little bit of a struggle with a Necro was Sustain. It's not so prominent anymore, but there's still times when Sustain can be difficult, and it can be tricky when you're trying to get corpses out and consume those for resources. It can be quite tricky still to like manage your resources. So it's nice to have things that don't require too much effort in terms of your gear sets, because then you can focus more time onto actually using your skills to benefit your group. So by using these 3 gear sets, they have very little effort required. Everything's just active 100% of the time. You don't have to micromanage the sets. They just are already there. Obviously, Tri-Stat enchants on all the gear with Divines because we need that Magicka Recovery boost, and the Tri-Stat gives a lot of extra max stats. And then for jewelry, it's a choice of Harmony or Infused. If you're going to be in a group where you know you're going to get synergies, an organised group, a half-decent dungeon group, in trials you definitely will, especially if you don't have an Alkosh user, let's say, then Harmony Jewelry is very good on the Necro and pretty essential for the Necro in some regards, because if you're going to be blocking quite a lot on a Necro, you're going to really struggle for stamina sustain. If you play more as an off-tank where you've got the ability to drop your block a little bit more often and you don't have to play in that kind of way, you can switch your food, you can play a bit more aggressively with less blocking, at which point you don't need to use Harmony. But Harmony Magicka Recovery is my favourite jewelry option. If I wasn't using this, if I was playing as an off-tank, I'd be using Infused with Tri-Cost Reduction. If I wasn't using Powerful Assault as an off-tank, I'd be using Infused Magicka Recovery. One of the things with the Necro is the Necro will potentially benefit more than other classes from Magicka cost reduction just because of the corpse creation. Because if you are casting your corpse skills very, very frequently, 2,600 Magicka, if you are hitting these on a regular basis, then obviously having Magicka cost reduction can also be quite good as well. But you have to be able to have enough Magicka incoming from recovery to be able to sustain the Magicka cost reduction. So you need to have over 2,000 Magicka recovery to be able to sustain having cost reduction as well. So that's something to think about. When you look at my bar setup, obviously Pierce Armor, essential skill if you're using a one-handed shield. Agony Totem, like I said before, for the minor protection for my group, for the minor vulnerability applied to the enemies, and then if there's an enemy that's not on crowd control immunity, they'll get the stun. My Necrotic Potency to get that ultimate back faster, Hungry Scythe for the heal, and then Power Bash to proc my Void Bash. If I was on a boss fight, I'd obviously switch this out, or maybe use Blast Bones, because obviously that's going to be more beneficial, or maybe Silver Leash if there's going to be adds. On the front bar, the ultimate can kind of be different, a variety of different things. You can use Barrier, you could use Reanimate, you could use a number of different things depending on how you're going to set up. You could use Warhorn on one bar and Colossus on the other bar. Like, if you wanted to have the option of using a Warhorn because maybe somebody else is using a Colossus, but then on your back bar, when you've got your Sacks available, because we're only one bar in Sacks, you could potentially have your Colossus with Sacks then to provide that double benefit. So, a couple of different ways to set up your ultimates. And then on your back bar, Frost Clench, great skill, very essential in most cases. It's a taunt, it's a major maim, it's a minor maim, and it's minor brittle. Really, really good skill that's worth having. Spirit Guardian, it's on the back bar because it's got a 16-second duration. It's pretty decent. If you wanted to, you could switch Agony Totem around with Spirit Guardian, but Agony Totem does have the shorter duration. Having Spirit Guardian on your front bar, you would get a couple of better passive benefits. Blockade of Frost, obviously to proc your enchant. It's going to give AoE minor breach as well. Beckoning armor, as we mentioned, really good skill. Major resolve, it creates a corpse. It pulls in enemies. And then unnerving boneyard to give us that AoE major breach. And then we've got the Colossus. Obviously, for other skills that you want to pick up, one hand and shield, you could use Heroic Slash for more ulti-gen. So you've already got a lot of ult building. Heroic Slash could be used as a way of getting additional minor heroism if you don't have it already. And then obviously you take all your passives for that. With your Destruction Staff, it's worth having pretty much all your skills. Pulsar, great skill for add pulls so you can get that AoE. Chilled effect, which you can combine with the blockade for the AoE minor breach. It also provides a debuff to the enemies, reducing their max health, minor mangle. It does minor protection as well, so really, really good. Your passives are all worth having here apart from Trifocus. I don't like using the Trifocus passive personally. And then you just want to take all of the passives that have some kind of benefit. Light armor passives are good. Medium armor passives are mostly good. So Windwalker especially. Athletic especially. All your heavy armor passives. And then you have to have Silver Leash available, I would say. Because for trial content, like if you need to chain enemies in fast, you cannot rely on Beckoning Armor. So Silver Leash from the Fighter's Guild is needed. Along with Intimidating Presence to reduce the cost of that Silver Leash by 15%. When it comes to Mage's Guild, I have Scalding Rune just in case. The very rare situation where I might use Elemental Catalyst. Scalding Rune is going to give me the benefit of the fire damage dot. And then I can proc that really easily. Balance is something I don't frequently use. But where I don't need to chain enemies in, and where I'm not corpse spamming, then Balance would be the next alternative. Instead of using Beckoning Armor. For Sigic Order, Race Against Time, you kind of need this because the Necro doesn't have a built-in speed boost. And for your Undaunted, you don't really need Inner Rage anymore if you've got Frost Clench. And Overflowing Altar is definitely an optional thing that you can use only if it's needed. And then you've got your couple of passives there, which are really, really vital. Because Undaunted Command, Undaunted Metal, really going to help with the Necro Sustain. In your Assault skill line, Resolving Vigor. Really good there because this was going to be used for like potentially your minor resolve. It's a heal over time. It can be helpful to use Resolving Vigor because if you're in a situation where you've got to move, your heal with Hungry Scythe can't be used on an enemy, can it? Because if you're moving and you've got no enemy to hit, how are you going to heal? So Resolving Vigor can sometimes be a better option for a heal for a Necro, or at least combined with Hungry Scythe, because you have to hit an enemy to heal with Hungry Scythe. With Resolving Vigor, you don't. So sometimes you do need this, and also it's often used for proccing your Powerful Assault. And then with your support skill line, your Barrier if you want the Magical Recovery, Efficient Purge as well if you wanted to be able to purge people, which sometimes is needed, and the Magical Recovery. And then if you really wanted to get some reliable major protection, you want to reduce your incoming damage, Revealing Flare is really good as well for getting that passively, and the Magic Aid on top of that. The strengths of the Necromancer Tank, just to kind of recap on everything. So they've got a strong DPS buff. If the group isn't using any major vulnerability sets, you've got the option of giving some really, really good damage boosting benefits to a group. They've got really good mitigation with the Guardian and the dot reduction that is vastly superior to most other classes when it comes to dealing with damage over time. They are the best at being able to manage those kind of situations. They've got great ultimate regeneration. The absolute best in the game for generating ultimate back faster, thanks to that necrotic potency and the ability to create corpses. And then you've also got the survivability and the group recovery. The Necro, again, is the most superior class in terms of recovery. They can recover things from the absolute worst case scenario where everybody might be dead. They can throw a reanimate down and bring everyone back. Now, some of the weaknesses. The Necromancer actually doesn't have any useful group buffs that are only supplied by the Necro. So you've got major vulnerability, but major vulnerability can be obtained in many different ways nowadays in the current game. Turning Tide, Archdruid, different things like that can obtain major vulnerability. So the Necro doesn't actually have any unique group buffs like other classes do. So in some ways, they are somewhat replaceable compared to other classes. Like a Dragon Knight has Brutality, They have Engulfing Flames. They have Stone Giant. Those are all unique that you can only get from a Dragon Knight. So you need to have a Dragon Knight there to provide those things. You don't need to have a Necro there. It's good to have them for the things that they are strong with, but they're not absolutely 100% essential because they are replaceable. And then their other group buffs, things like Minor Vulnerability, things like the group Minor Protection, the AoE Major Breach that they can provide, all those other benefits that they do have access to can be achieved in other ways just as easily. So the Necro for me isn't absolutely 100% essential. They can be still a little bit difficult to sustain. So newer players will find the biggest struggle with the Necro in terms of stamina sustain. It's still a little bit of an issue now, but it's not as predominant as it used to be. So there's been a big improvement on the sustain for a Necro, but there's still a little bit of an issue there for some people. And like, the final main weakness for the Necro is the self-healing. So the self-healing can be a massive, massive problem, because if you're in transitional fights, so Halls of Fabrications where you've got to switch the tanks over between the bosses, things like that where you've got to transition, where you are moving and you need to heal, your healing capability is quite low. So that can be a major problem for people on a Necro. And I think that just about does it, guys. That is everything for the Necro Tank guide and build. I hope you enjoyed it.